What's up, guys? April has been an unbelievably rough month for me for playing chess. I've had some extremely low lows, and in this video, I'm going to show you a quick win I had. Even though I have been playing bad, it is one of my better games. So, with that being said, let's get right into it. All right, so the game starts off with the French defense exchange variation, and normally when I'm playing the French defense, I always try to play the exchange variation. I just like having that open e-file. And after a series of simple book moves, I move my light square bishop to f2, defending this e2 to defend this f3 pawn. My opponent castles, I castle. We both get our kings out of the center. And it's right about here, after some small development on both sides, my opponent finally decides to move their pawn to h6, attacking this dark square bishop on g5. So in this position, I take the knight, and my opponent takes back, and I finally centralize my rook by moving it from f1 to e1, trying to apply a bit of pressure on this e file. And right here, I thought the best idea was I need to somehow create some space, so I'm going to move my knight to g4 and then eventually try to either get to c5. But my opponent did not let me get my knight to c5, so I simply did not want my knight to get trapped, because a simple thing that most people might overlook is that if you move your pawn to c3 to reinforce the center, your knight has zero open spaces they can go to. And I didn't want to trap my knight, so I simply moved my pawn from b2 to b3, which the computer didn't really like, but whatever, it is what it is. And then I moved my pawn to c3, finally reinforcing the center, so if my opponent was to attack my knight by moving their pawn to b5, I could simply just move my knight back to b2. But in this position, after my opponent moved their knight to c6, I started to calculate, and I realized, oh crap, I cannot take this pawn here on c5, and the reason I can't take is that if my opponent takes back, I can take back with the knight, but the ultimate problem is that my opponent will then take with their dark square bishop on c3, and it will then fork both of my rooks. So I decided instead that I'm just going to move my rook on a1 to c1 to defend this position, so that I can prepare for this upcoming attack. Me and my opponent exchange pieces, and it's right here I make a huge blunder. The reason why this is a huge blunder is because after a series of moves of my opponent taking my rook on e1, I take back with my queen. All my opponent needs to do here is take this pawn on d4, and then I will take back, and then they will take, and I will be down either a knight or a pawn, pretty much. But luckily for me, my opponent makes a blunder, and in this exact position, I capitalize. I simply just exchanged rooks, and now that we traded off rooks, I'm simply able to take this free knight. And the reason why I'm able to take this knight is because there's no checkmating ideas, because I have my knight planted on f3. So even if my opponent was to move their queen to c1, I can simply bring my queen back to e1, and it would defend the position. I also had a little escape here too, but that was mostly what I saw when I played this move. So after my opponent takes my pawn on h3, I simply bring my light square bishop back to defend this, because I had a feeling that my opponent is trying to bring their queen to g4, trying to get a checkmate on this g2 square. So just as I was right, my opponent brought their queen to g4, and I simply brought my queen back to c3 to defend this knight. And after a small series of exchanges, I'm in this sort of endgame position where I am up 4 points of material. Even though my opponent does have more pawns, I do have two more minor pieces, even though one of them is inactive right now, as the knight is on the side of the board. But that's an issue for later. So I simply offer a queen trade. My opponent does not want it, so I finally bring out my light square bishop. The reason I'm able to bring out my light square bishop is because even if they try to move their queen to a1, I can simply just bring it right back. And I offer another queen trade. My opponent says no. My opponent tries to move their queen to a1. I simply move my light square bishop back again. And now I offer another queen trade. They say no, so I simply bring my knight out to c4, and I know a lot of people here might be like, okay, well, what happens if he moves the pawn to d4? You know, like I can easily take it, but I wasn't really thinking that. I'm trying to get my minor piece into the game so I can try to checkmate my opponent. I have the pieces to checkmate my opponent. So my opponent is now trying to apply a late push to my king side, and I simply bring my light square bishop in now. Now I'm applying pressure to this diagonal and my opponent's queen. They move the queen, I check, my opponent moves, I check again, and in this position, I simply just take the free pawn, and now that my knight is on d5, I am covering this exit square, and my opponent doesn't really have anywhere that they can go, right? They cannot escape this way. Their only means of escape, sorry, not their only means of escape are actually to the right of the board on the F, G, and H file. And luckily for me, my opponent blunders checkmate in one by moving their pawn to H4, and I simply bring my queen to H8, and that is checkmate. Anyways, like I said, April has not been the best month for me, but I looked at game review, and game review said I played something like a 2000, maybe even a 2100. So hopefully this is a right step or a big step in the right direction, and I'm hoping I can use momentum to finally get back to getting close to 1500. But with that being said, thank you all for watching, and I will catch you guys in the next video.